I oversee Miami-Dade College's Hialeah campus, and I will be your voluntary room host this morning. We are delighted to have you with us, and if you've looked through the schedule of events today, you'll see that there are many venues of author sessions running throughout the day and tomorrow, plus activities in the Children's Alley and programs in the Swamp and the Porch, and much, much more. Please consider becoming a member of the Friends of the Book Fair. Your charitable contribution will support this wonderful program, and Friends receive multiple benefits, such as preferential seating and admission to special book fair events, and we greatly appreciate our friends. And this year, your supporting the fair is easier than ever. Just text the word book to 501-501 to donate $10. You will receive a text back asking to confirm your donation, and it's as easy as that. The Miami Book Fair does not end tomorrow. Miami Book Fair programs, events, and activities take place throughout the year, here and all over Miami. And we are grateful to the college and to the hundreds of volunteers and authors that make all of it possible. There will be a brief question and answer sessions that the authors have agreed to throughout the program near the end, and they will be autographing books immediately after this session on the red autographing area that is located downstairs in Building 1. Now kindly silence your cell phones, and so that there will be no interruptions, I would like to introduce Ms. Clydette DeGroot from the DeGroot Foundation to introduce this morning's extraordinary panel. Welcome.
I agree, this is an extraordinary panel. As I read each one of their books, I kept saying, oh, if I could just write like that. They are amazing writers. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists this morning, and I'll begin to the far end with Elizabeth Alexander. Elizabeth is a poet, essayist, playwright, and teacher. She's published numerous books of poems, including American Sublime, which is one of the three finalists for the Pulitzer Prize, a young adult collection, Miss Crandall's School for Young Ladies and Little Misses of Color, which won a 2008 Connecticut Book Award. And most recently, she published Crave Radiance, New and Selected Poems, 1990 to 2010. She received the Anisfeld Wolf Lifetime Achievement Award, and she has received numerous teaching awards for her educational programs. In her memoir, Light of the World, Alexander finds herself at an existential crossroads after the sudden death of her husband. Channeling her poetic sensibilities into a rich, lucid prose, Alexander tells a love story that is itself a story of loss. As she reflects on the beauty of her married life, the trauma resulting from her husband's death, and the solace found in caring for her two teenage sons, Alexander universalizes a very personal quest for meaning and acceptance in the wake of loss. Our second panelist, Mary Karr, is the author of three award-winning best-selling memoirs, The Liars Club, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, Cherry, and Lit, which was one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 Best Books of the Year and a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. A Guggenheim Fellow in Poetry, Karr has won Pushcart Prizes for both verse and essays. She is the Peck Professor of Literature at Syracuse University. In her new book, we have some people here from Syracuse. In her new book, The Art of Memoir, Karr synthesizes her expertise as professor and therapy patient, writer and spiritual seeker, recovered alcoholic, and black belt sinner, providing a unique window into the mechanics and art of memoir that is as irreverent, insightful, and entertaining as her own work in the genre. In their top 10 notable book citations, the New York Times Book Review calls it a masterclass in the art of memoir. And our final panelist, from the Chicago neighborhoods where she grew up and set her groundbreaking book, The House on Mango Street, to her abode in Mexico, in a region where, as she writes, my ancestors lived for centuries, The places Sandra Cisneros has lived have provided inspiration for her now classic works of fiction and poetry. But a house of her own, where she could truly take root, has eluded her. With her new book, A House of My Own, Stories from My Life, this illustrated collection spanning nearly 3 decades and including never before published work, Cisneros has come home at last. Ranging from the private, her parents' loving and tempestuous marriage, to the political, a rallying cry for one woman's liberty in Sarajevo, to the literary, a tribute to Marguerite Duras, and written with her trademark sensitivity and honesty, these poignant, unforgettable pieces give us not only her most transformative memories, but also a revelation of her artistic and intellectual influences. She too has received many awards, including the American Book Award, and she was also a MacArthur Fellow. Please welcome our 3 panelists.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am so excited to be here with these amazing, amazing women. I'm very, very happy. So I'm going to read a few sections from The Light of the World. It's told in jagged time, so these are our little poetic movements. Henry Ford believed the soul of a person is located in their last breath, and so captured the last breath of his best friend Thomas Edison in a test tube and kept it evermore. It is on display at the Henry Ford Museum outside Detroit, like Galileo's finger in the church of Santa Croce, but Edison's last breath is an invisible relic. Ficre breathed the last breath into me when I opened his mouth and breathed everything I had into him. He felt like a living person then. I am certain his soul was there. And then in the ambulance, riding the long ride down to the hospital, even as they worked and worked, the first icy wind blew into me. He was going or gone. I need to call somebody, don't I? I asked the ambulance driver, a woman. Yes, you do, she said. Black men die catastrophically across class more than anybody else in America. Toni Morrison, not a house in the country ain't packed to its rafters with some dead Negro's grief. He was an African man, an Eritrean man, and an African-American man. He was a black man. He was not the descendant of slaves. He literally walked across his country through killing fields to escape. When he was 16 years old, he walked into the dust of Khartoum. He was a refugee in Sudan, in Italy, in Germany, and in the United States, where he would wind up living in New Haven, Connecticut, for far longer than he had lived anywhere else. He washed dishes in Italy, attended school before he knew a word of the language in a Germany so racially hostile it almost broke him. He went years without seeing his parents. His parents and his community built him to survive, but it was not without price. His big heart burst. You tell the story. No, you tell the story. I had just recovered from a rather significant romantic misstep and had fled Chicago to New Haven, to Yale, at the invitation of my director friend Leah to write a play. I hoped new work would heal me. A friend took me to see Reggie the Psychic of Brooklyn, New York. You better get yourself together, girl, Reggie said, because your man is on his way and you can't stop this love from coming. This is no regular Negro, Reggie said. He's from someplace tiny that no one's ever heard of. I see you in a kitchen picking up a conversation where you left off, even though you just met each other. He's a painter, said Reggie. The paintings are big and the colors look like sunset, like the American Southwest. I want one. And here comes the baby, Reggie said. It's a boy, and he's coming sooner than you think. And by the way, you want to be a playwright? Guess who you're going to meet tomorrow? Mr. George C. Wolfe. Pish tosh, I thought, and then went on about my business. Reggie the Psychic. A few weeks later, I was sitting in a cafe in New Haven, drinking my orange pineapple smoothie and minding my own business. I was to meet an old friend. Strangely, she never arrived. Excuse me, he said, like so many songs go. I looked up from my book, and thus we proceeded to talk. I loved that she was an artist. I loved that she was a teacher. I loved that she had short hair. A torque inside my stomach, the science of love. I was headed back to Chicago that week and so wrote down for him 517 West Roscoe Street, Chicago, Illinois 60615, and then last minute my local telephone number for the next few days. The phone was ringing when I went back to my campus apartment. Would you like to come by for coffee tomorrow? And I said yes, and he said, call me when you set out walking and I will wait for you. There he stood on the corner of George and State Streets waiting for me, smiling. I went for coffee and I never left. And did I remember to say, the day after speaking to Reggie, I met the great George C. Wolfe at the theater in New Haven, totally by chance. In Lucille Clifton's poems, the living and the dead speak across the veil. Over the years, I have read those poems over and over, especially this one, The Death of Fred Clifton, 11/10/84, age 49. I seem to be drawn to the center of myself, leaving the edges of me in the hands of my wife. And then I saw with the most amazing clarity, so that I had not eyes but sight. And rising and turning through my skin, there was all around not the shapes of things, but oh, at last, the things themselves. Was that what dying was like? A drawing into essence, a concentrated drop that would then evaporate off the earth? I seem to be drawn, Clifton writes in the voice of her dead husband. He cannot be sure what is happening. But the dead husband speaks from solid ground when he states in the poem that he is leaving the edges of me in the hands of my wife. We grasp at the tattered edges and don't let go. What we clutch is a rent garment, but it is ours and what is left now. The poem yields more as Fred Clifton moves closer to true knowing, as he sees with the most amazing clarity. Death itself is like a snake shedding its skin. Fred Clifton describes rising and turning through his skin. A new self reveals itself when the old carapace has shed and died, as though we live in exoskeletons with something truer underneath. Death comes with a gift in the poem. Our loved ones tell us here that what we see with our eyes is different from what we know, the things themselves. Oh, at last is the moment of exaltation in the poem. Lamentation and exaltation are simultaneous here. I am a widow. I am Ficre's widow, clutching at his edges. I cannot hold on to the garment. I cannot imagine what sight awaits me. And then to conclude, we loved Jimmy Scott's version of the David Byrne song, Heaven. Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. These days, I picture heaven populated by the umber angels Ficre painted in abundance, but that seems too fanciful. I never truly believed in heaven and cannot manufacture it. Little Jimmy Scott's plaintiveness seems right when he sings, nothing ever happens. How better to describe the infinite solitude of the afterlife? When this kiss is over, it will start again. It will not be any different. It will be exactly the same, he sings. Each kiss is fixed. It is the same long kiss, but it will never change. That is the comfort, and that is the heartbreak. One night at bedtime, Simon asks if I want to come with him to visit Ficre in heaven. Yes, I say, and lie down on his bed. First you close your eyes, he says, and ride the clear glass elevator. Up we go. What do you see? I ask. God is sitting at the gate, he answers. What does God look like, he asks. Like God, Mama, he says. Now we go to where Daddy is. He has 2 rooms, Simon says. One room with a single bed and his books and another where he paints. The painting room is vast. He can look out any window he wants and paint. That room has 4 views: our backyard, the dock he painted in Maine, Asmara, and New Mexico. New Mexico, I ask. Yes, Simon said, the volcano crater with the magic grass. Ah, yes, I say, the caldera, where we saw the gophers and the jackrabbits and the elk running across, and Daddy called it the veldt. Yes, do you see it? And I do. The light is perfect for painting. His bed in heaven is a single bed. Okay, it's time to go now, Simon says, so down we go. You can come with me any time, he says. Thank you, my darling. I don't think you can find it by yourself yet, he says, but one day you will. Thank you.
such a privilege to be here with these two accomplished writers. Thank you, guys. I'm not going to read. I'm just going to yak for a minute. Writing a memoir, if it's done right, is knocking yourself out with your own fist. When I was about 10 years old, I wrote in the only journal that I still have from my childhood, "When I grow up, I will write 1/2 poetry and 1/2 autobiography." And then under that I wrote, really pathetically, "I am not very successful as a little girl. When I grow up, I will probably be a mess." So I was prescient, I think. I don't know what it was about memoir that so captivated me. I think I was, as you can tell from that passage, just a little weirdo, goofball, bookish knucklehead of a girl in an East Texas backwater, reading poetry, and my mother had used Shakespeare as a booster seat. And so from the age of 5, if you asked me what I wanted to be, I said a poet. And it just seemed the most exalted thing. So imagine my surprise when I was in junior high and my junior high school principal said, I had been sent to my principal not for the first or the last time for arguing that I didn't want to study geometry. And he said, if you persist, he said, what do you want to do instead? You're going to be able to alter recipes when you cook for your husband. And when you're sewing, you'll be able to, alter things because you'll know mathematics. And I said, well, first off, neither of those things have anything to do with geometry. Next, I want to be a poet. And he said the strangest sentence to me. He said, if you persist in this delusion that you're going to grow up and become a poet, this is the actual sentence he says, you will wind up no more than a common prostitute. I know, right? I didn't expect great riches or the adulation of millions, but I didn't think I'd wind up a hooker. But so I don't know what it was about memoir. I just think I was a lonely, weird little kid. And something about reading about someone else's life, so a single voice crying out of the wilderness of her own lived experience, just made me feel less lonely, I think. I must have read Helen Keller. Must have been like the first autobiography I read, but I remember reading Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings" when I was in the 10th grade, and being shocked that you could write about working people. It was just didn't make any sense to me. I would go to the library and read The New Yorker because that was the only place you could get contemporary poetry. Everything else was, By the Shores of Gitche Gumee, Longfellow, Hiawatha, and all those people who were writing fiction and poetry were using, they went to Yale and they wore deck shoes and they used the word summer as a verb. And none of my people did those things, We all had shotguns and bass boats and union cards if we were lucky. We were out of the great, if you get work right tradition. And so I don't know what it was about memoir that I was so obsessed about, but I spent about the past 30 years teaching it at various places. And it's a really kind of primitive, trailer park, trashy form. When people talk about it, some of the reviews I've gotten, it's amazing. I've actually been very lucky with the Art of Memoir. I can't believe, I was expecting to go out and see two sort of sad people sitting there with me in a bookstore. So I think there's something about this day and age as fiction has gotten more hyper-intellectual or dystopic or, dare we say, pretentious. Something about the people who are writing about their own lives. and writing shamelessly using the first person and not writing about things in this kind of sci-fi way. Are people who are interested in reality, which is what the novel used to deal with, and short stories. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think of Gabriel Garcia Marquez as writing about reality. I remember his saying in one of my favorite interviews, surreal, that's how life is in South America. So I think great novels tell great truths, don't get me wrong. And I certainly think a novel is a more exalted form than a memoir, which is episodic. I mean, it's Tuesday, then it's Thursday. I mean,
But something about it at this day and age, it's not that the memory isn't corrupt, and I just want to say, people say there's a really fuzzy line between fact and fiction. No, there isn't. Not a fuzzy line. There's a fuzzy line between memory and imagination, between what you remember and what you imagine. There's a big watery area there. But Greg Mortensen didn't believe he was kidnapped by the Taliban. James Fry didn't think he'd gone to prison and just hallucinated that that had happened, and he happened to write it in a book. If you set out to make stuff up that never happened to you and represent it as though it did, you're lying, which is fine. You can do, the great thing about the age that we live in is you can have as much fiction, you can have as much blurred line between fiction and fact as you want. You just admit it. If you read Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior, there's a lot of fantasy, there's a lot of spectacle, there's a lot of exalted reality. But it's not represented. You don't believe she actually flew across the clouds, as her mother flew across the clouds as a swordswoman. So if you're thinking about writing a memoir and you're thinking, gosh, this is such a fuzzy line, I can't. If you're trying to fake people out, you're lying, and that's fine. Just call it something else. So I'm not going to wobble on and chatter on, but thank you guys very much for having us and to talk about this. And Sandra Cisneros.
I don't know how many times I've come to Miami, but this is the book fairs, and I think it's because it's like a symphony. You have to have a great conductor, and the musicians are these wonderful volunteers. People are so happy to help you here, and I just want to thank the volunteers. So somebody's doing something right about treating them well, that they keep coming back. So I once had to start a small press book fair when I lived in San Antonio, Texas, and it was very small, and it was hard work. To do it so many years in this time is extraordinary. So I do want to thank our host for bringing us together, coordinating this symphony and doing it so beautifully. I don't know what I'm doing on this panel. I'm not a memoirist, but no one told me that I wrote a memoir. I just wrote these stories that were about my life, and the next thing I knew, I was on this 7-week book tour, and then people said, well, when you wrote your memoir, and I thought, me? So I guess this is a memoir, but if I'd known it was a memoir, I wouldn't have been able to do it. Okay. It's a little bug there, and I don't like to kill bugs. Okay, I want to read a piece I think that is about a time in my life when I call my year of my near death, which was 1987, a very good year for California wine, a very bad year for Sandra Cisneros. I was living in California, and it was very, very difficult, and I think when people become suicidal, it's because they feel they've let other people down. And I felt that way at 33. Even though I'd written House on Mongo Street, I didn't earn very much money from it. I didn't know what my purpose on the planet was. I kept borrowing money from my family. And I was a girl, not married, no health insurance, and I was ashamed of myself. So I came through that year, which is another essay. But I want to read about something that happened right after the year of my near death. I got to meet my hero, Astor Piazzolla, the composer and musician who plays the bandoneon. It's this big instrument. It looks like a giant accordion, but it's actually related to the organ. And if I had known that that's what I could be something other than a writer, I would like to be a bandoneon player. So I want to read just a very brief story about meeting my hero. I met the Argentine tango composer and musician Astor Piazzolla in 1988 on a Sunday, April 24th, at the Great American Music Hall on O'Farrell Street, San Francisco. I'm sure of the date because I have a signed flyer to prove it. I needn't have bothered. The date is engraved in my corazon. The year before, I'd barely survived the 33rd year of my life, a time when you die and hopefully are resurrected. So 1988 was the year of my resurrection. I remember driving the 5 hours from Chico, California, where I was a guest professor, convinced Astor Piazzolla, the man who had revolutionized tango, had come to California to meet me. The year of my near death, I'd lost my purpose for living. I know it sounds overly dramatic, but that's the truth. I was tired of the nuisance of staying alive. I couldn't understand why I was put on the planet if I couldn't seem to do anything that would earn me my keep. I was weepy and nervous and skittish as a cat. In Texas, I'd been without a job for almost a year. A friend teaching at Cal State Chico was taking a temporary leave, and he had recommended me for his position. The last thing I wanted was to teach at a university. I'd never felt at home there. The truth was, I didn't feel smart enough as a student, let alone as a professor. Yet here was a job at a university being offered to me. I was so broke, I was forced to overlook my terror and take it. I borrowed money from my family for the umpteenth time, dragged my thrift store furniture in a trailer, and soon discovered what I had feared all along. I was a failure. The lethargy of my freshman composition students compared to the adults I taught at community centers convinced me I was no good. I was worthless. I was a dud. At least that was the way I saw it then. And if I wasn't any good at teaching, and if I was 33 years old and still borrowing to get by, and so what if I'd written a book that earned me hardly enough money to cover a few months' rent? And I hated being in academia, feeling like I had to know everything when I hardly knew anything. And what if I was discovered for being the fraud I was? And if I had to borrow money from my family one more time, well, I'd lost my will to go on. But a National Writing Award arrived in the nick and reminded me why I was put on the planet. And now, here I was. And here he was, Astor Piazzolla, one of the greatest musicians and composers of the new tango, the greatest, in my opinion, coming to play for me. I'd been introduced to the music of Piazzolla in my mid-20s by my nemesis, the Zapata of my heart, who inspired several poems and stories and my travels through Europe so that I might become exactly like him, worldly and sophisticated instead of the naive fraidy cat that I was. Piazzolla's music, a tempest of notes, came by way of this man, my lover, who in a sense was the same as the music. A yelp caught somewhere between pain and pleasure, a howl filled with longing and despair, the little burn a mouth leaves on the flesh, intense, tender, comical, ferocious, faithless, and ultimately doomed. All of this haunts me when I listen to Piazzolla's compositions, merging the traditional Buenos Aires tango with the New York avant-garde jazz. Piazzolla taught me how to become the artist I wanted to become. It's like this, you fool, I imagine Piazzolla saying, listen. And the yowl of his bandoneon, a collision of beauty and tragedy bloodied together, became my teacher. I was hungry to serve my apprenticeship. When I was lost, sad, defeated, frustrated with my writing, with my life, I had only to listen to Piazzolla's music and it would shine a light beam into the night, an arrow piercing a target, a guide as pure and steady as the North Star. This explains my supreme arrogance and naivete in the darkness of the great American Music Hall that day in 1988. El Maestro emerged on stage, all in black as his bandoneon, dignified, divine. Then he began. A music that rose up terrible like a knife held at one's own heart, weepy, melodramatic, corny, wonderful, all at once, violin, bandoneon, cello, piano like rain. I had to stand up and lean against a pillar, blow my nose with a cocktail napkin. When the lights blinked on for intermission, I took off backstage. I wasn't drunk. How to explain the absolute confidence of my mission? I shoved the swinging doors that separated the gods from the rabble and marched right in. Surprisingly, there were no security guards, no bouncers or police, no one, just a sad, empty corridor, too shabby to shelter greatness. Outside an open doorway, I heard voices and suddenly lost my courage. Then the outrageousness of my actions caught up with me. Astor and his musicians were probably exhausted and taking a well-deserved break. I was at a loss at what to do next. Luckily, somebody appeared to solve the problem. A young guy with the same idea of meeting his idol as me, but with more bravado. We started jabbering loud enough so that eventually Piazzolla popped out to see why we were there. The fan knew exactly what he wanted. He asked for an autograph and handed Piazzolla a cheap yellow flyer announcing the evening's event. What else could I do but get ready to do the same? But what would I say to him? First, I had to tell him. I had to tell him what I'd been holding in my heart all these years. I wanted to say, Astor, your music has buoyed me through so many disappointments, through the exploding cigars of love, through near death, through my own death and resurrection. I traveled to find myself when I listened to your music. It was your music I listened to for courage when I first arrived on the Greek islands in the Aegean and on the boat that pulled me away from Greece, where I finally finished my first novel. And on the cold nights in Paris when I didn't have any money and was sleeping on the floor of the Argentines. Astor, you don't know. It's been so hard to invent myself and become the writer I've wanted to become. I had to run away from home. I had to buy a one-way ticket to Athens because I'd never been anywhere alone before, even though I was almost 30. And when I was washing my socks in the sink on a cold winter morning in Chicago or in Tuscany, in the pre-Alps of southern France, or in South Texas, riding across town on a bicycle, or driving across country, Astor, you taught me with your music the kind of passion I wanted to reach in my work. I'm aware, Astor, you struggle to find your own voice, how your teacher, Nadia Boulanger, advised you to take up the instrument you had abandoned because you were embarrassed by the bandoneon. She was reminding you to remember who you are, and by making you feel less ashamed and praising you for being no one but you, and sent you back to that despised part of yourself because it was you had abandoned. And in that monster of a box, you'd been able to leap from the sentimental to sentiment, which is a fine line, and how the traditionalists wanted to murder you for what you did to their tango, and how it had been so hard for me to become a writer. But your music, Astor, your music had shown me when I was cold and afraid to be fearless. You made the tango yours, Astor, and it became mine the years of my 20s. And now, in my early 30s, having just barely escaped the maw of death, that terror was your music, Astor. Everything was your music. The nemesis I loved who abandoned me, and how from that open wound I had transformed the yelp into a howl, and that howl was my work, inspired by you, Astor. Do you understand? All this, I thought, while the guy in front of me was getting his flyer signed. And now, it was my turn. and Astor Piazzolla in his black trousers with their sharp creases and his silky black shirt and polished black boots, Astor, with only his hands and face illuminating the moment, was reaching out and taking my flyer from my hand. I stood there with my mouth open a little. Now, as he signed, I needed to tell him. It was my chance, yes. I could say it now. I could tell him. Now. Senor Piazzolla, I said breathlessly, your work is my life. He nodded, passed my flyer on down the line to his fellow musicians to sign, and then my moment was gone. I clenched that autograph flyer in one fist and wobbled back to my seat, feeling foolish and weepy. Your work is my life? What was I thinking? Then I put my head down to write. Thing in my shoe, dandelion, thorn, thumbprint, one grain of grief that has me undone once more. Oh, my father, heartily sorry I am for this right side of the brain, who has alarmed and maimed and laid me many a day now, invalid low. And when I raised my head, I had a new book of poetry, just as if I'd gone through childbirth. My body changed, startling me with flesh where I'd once had bone. I put my head down again, and again, when I raised it, another book, and again, my body altered so that I was no longer myself, but a woman staring at a woman from the other side of water. Books, and more changes to the house one calls the self. Young people get in line to meet the author and have their book autographed. I am the author they've come to meet. Some of them barely able to talk, their eyes like ships lost at sea. You don't know what this means to me, they say, fumbling with the page they want me to sign. You just don't know. Thank you.
Q&A?
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes for question, and this mic is open for our guests.
Thank you. This question is for all of you, but it formulated while I was listening to you, Elizabeth Alexander. The question is, what happens to grief when you share it in literature and in public like this?
Well, so many answers, and so many answers from one person over time, I think, to that question. What I have found is that in writing this book, I found that it actually wasn't just about grief, or that grief was a very, very capacious container that had at its center love and human connection. Thinking that I was writing a sad book, and instead discovering that there were many, many, many things in what it meant in the immediate aftermath of unexpected loss, to chronicle what was happening. I think that sharing this book with other people has taken me by surprise in a really great way, because grief is a universal, loss is a universal. None of us outruns death. None of us outruns loss. None of us. Not one of us here in this room. We all come knowing something of grief. Are you going to?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then you'll give us the handbook on
exactly.
how to. But we'll be faced with it. And so what I found in going around with this book is that there are so many points of connection, and also that many of them are about what does it mean to know that you found love, about first love, about immigrant families and United States families, that particular blending that happens to have been my experience, about the intimacy of life with children. Many, many other subjects under that grief umbrella have been points of connection for me with this book, which has been enormously interesting and rich and gratifying.
I just want to echo what Elizabeth said. that I think the most privileged person in this room with the nicest vehicle and the best complexion and blah, 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 suffers the torments of the damned. Just going about the business of being a human being. And one way we meet each other, I think, is, you know, in the beginning was the word, is through language. And poetry was my first love, and for me it was always Eucharistic. You know, you take you take somebody else's passion or suffering into the meat of your body, and you're changed by it. And in communion, we all also become a community. I mean, we're all here because we're readers, and we all have inner lives as big as Lake Superior. So I think getting to swim together, I think, is what it means, is that sense of connection and for me, a reduction of loneliness. I'm always shocked by the wonderful stories people tell me about their lives. So.
I also have written about grief in a book called Have You Seen Marie? And the epilogue is in this new book. And some of the things I learned about it is that when you're in mourning, your heart is open like the aperture of a camera. And that's exactly where you strive to get to every time you write a page. You have to meditate really hard to open your heart that wide. But if you're already there, because your heart has been broken, then you should create. So I wrote an epilogue about what I learned from grieving, and I just want to read 3 paragraphs. I knew as I wrote Have You Seen Marie that it was helping to bring me back to myself. It's essential to create when the spirit is dying. It doesn't matter what. Sometimes it helps to draw, sometimes to plant a garden, sometimes to make a Valentine's Day card or to sing or assemble an altar. Creating nourishes the spirit, and when you're grieving, your spirit is dying. There is no getting over death, only learning how to travel alongside it. It knows no linear time. Sometimes the pain is as fresh as if it just happened. Sometimes it's a space I tap with my tongue daily like a missing molar. Say what they say, some may doubt the existence of God, but everyone is certain of the existence of love. Something is there then beyond our lives that, for lack of a better word, I'll call spirit. Some know it by other names. I know it only as love. And one thing I learned from losing people very close to me is that love never dies. You continue to receive, and you can continue to give it.
Yes, your work has changed my life. I just want to ask you, in one reference to the Greek islands, and you know, the new immigrants to the Greek islands today from Syria and elsewhere, and how can our work respond to the intolerance, the wave of intolerance that is coming up in this country?
Yes.
In response to those new
Yes, do we all want to answer that? Because I want to say something very strongly. I think I'm in this place of absolute, my face in the dust. I don't feel like voting. I don't want to tell you to vote. I'm disgusted with politicians in Mexico, and I'm disgusted with the politicians globally. So it's not exclusive to Mexico. At least in Mexico, we know the politicians are corrupt and the system and the media all lie. Here, people still believe in the media. And I am in a point, and I know from traveling across the country that we're all in this place, like, what do we do? So I'm just tired of the leaders. They're not leading us. And I ask you, and especially you, all of you, to be ambassadors. We're all going to have to be ambassadors for peace, because the solution our leaders are giving us is more violence. And that's not the way. We're not asking the peace leaders. There are peace people who are among us. So you're all going to have to rise up and be ambassadors of peace. Some of us through teaching, some of us through writing. You, in your life, think of all the people that come into your life. And I recommend a book that changed my life in my political activism. It's a book called Being Peace by the Vietnam Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't get it, but was nominated by Dr. Martin Luther King. Being Peace, it's on my website. Please read it. Please, all of you, rise up to be ambassadors, because I just feel that that's the only way.
Sorry. I'm so sorry.
I just want to say thank you. And one of my questions, Mary, for you. One of the things I love about reading your work is to think, oh my God, how does she understand me? And that's what I love about reading. It's that experience without having to have a lot of conversations with others, that intimate feeling. So as I stand up here now, I'm sort of embarrassed.
Oh, I cry all the time.
I
Don't
just
never be
wonder,
embarrassed to
whatever
cry.
makes a good writer, or if you ever set out to say, this is what I need to do to be a good writer, it's been accomplished. And I wonder, as memoirists, you know, how it feels. I'm sure you have people dumping their stories on you all the time and saying, oh my God, I feel like I know me. And I just wondered how that feels and if that's heavy to you and how you deal with it.
It's a privilege. I mean, people, you know, most of what people have to tell you is boring. Weather is boring, you know, cocktail parties are boring. There's a reason I'm at home in my pajamas all day. It's because I have a low tolerance for tedium. But somebody telling you out of the depths of their, you know, suffering or humanity or those broken places where, you know, the light comes through, that's always a privilege. So I don't feel it as heavy. I mean, I feel completely helpless with people who want me to help them get their books published. I mean, for that I would say, I had an interesting interview with someone who was talking about how you develop a platform. And if you want to have a book published, I have one surefire solution that both these women know about. Learn how to write. If you write at this level, somebody's going to publish your book. So about publishing, I'm clueless. I don't know. But somebody telling me how they feel is always it's a privilege. So.
I have a question. Since you write about such intimate details of your lives, I'm curious, how do you protect family members, or if you do protect family members when you're sharing your intimate stories? And if you don't, how are you handling the fallout from something getting published that's so personal and intimate?
Well, I can start. I had to do that with my sons, with my children, and to do it in the time period when being their mother was obviously the most important thing. They lose their father suddenly at 12 and 13. So that's still my only non-negotiable purpose on earth. And do I believe that? Yes, I believe that. Just checking. So I knew that I had to write. I had learned that from other writers. You know, I had learned that from listening to other writers say, you may not have to publish it now, you may not have to publish it for a long, long time, you may not publish it ever, but you have to write it. That as artists, we have to make things, and that also my children needed to understand that their parents were artists. That's how we're made, that's what we do, that's what we try to offer to the world. And so that doesn't mean that it overrides what they need, but it means that they need to understand that that's what they were raised in. But you know, I read my younger son came home one day when I was having a bad writing day. Usually they don't see that. I don't want them to see that, but I couldn't get out of it. He said, "What's wrong?" I said, "The writing's bad." And he said, "Well, come read it to me." And I said, No, I can read it to you. And he went, sat down at the kitchen table, pulled up a chair, called his brother, got a snack, sit down, read. So I said, "Well, you know, Daddy dies in the book." And he said, "I know." You know, I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that. And they said, keep reading, keep reading, keep reading. And we talked and we cried and we disagreed and we argued, and they said a red jacket, not a blue jacket. And we talked about what it meant to remember something truthfully if the details might be different in memory and what mattered and what didn't. Mm-hmm. And it was a very, very powerful process to be in with them that I then repeated before I gave the final manuscript to my editor. Mm-hmm. And that we then had to repeat again when it was time for a piece of it to be published. And I looked at the galleys and saw their names in print and thought, I've done something terrible. What have I done? But actually, the checks were both also reminded me that they have memories of their father that I don't know, and that's a beautiful thing for us within our family. And that you do the best you can, being mindful of your human responsibilities that go along with your responsibilities as a writer. So that's just my experience, no pronouncements there.
You have more experience in your memoir.
Oh, I notify everybody before I write about them and give them the chance, like, Mom, remember when you tried to kill me with a butcher knife? I was thinking I might write about that. And my mother was like, oh, get it off your chest. My mother was such a badass, she really doesn't care what any of you think. Now that she's gone to live with Jesus, she really doesn't. So, and then I wrote it, and unlike Elizabeth, I didn't have the balls to tell people as I was writing what I was saying. I waited until I was completely done. And I did something slightly different with my son. I told him about it, but he didn't actually hear the actual pages because he didn't want to. So I think it's very cool what you were able to do with your son. But none of the stories that are in any of the books did my son not know. Do you know? So, but I mean, when I was writing about my sexual assault as a child, I wouldn't want my kid to read that. But he knew before Cherry came out, or Liars Club, you know, I was sexually assaulted when I was a kid. And he was like, I knew that. So, but oddly, I didn't have it. And then I sent pages to everybody I ever wrote about. And it's the strangest thing to me is that nobody ever changed anything. And I think it's because my books are written because they seem so interior, that sort of interiority. We were talking about the inner life, the life lived in the scene. And I don't think, so I don't think anybody ever was kind of looked like journalism or authority. I think it looked like a subjective take. So maybe that's why nobody changed anything. Not because my memory's so great.
Martina's father has this lovely quote, if you have a family secret and you don't want your family to know, put it in a book of poetry. And I would say in a book of fiction too, because my family never talks to me about what I write. But this book, there's photos and there's pictures, they're in it, and I'm still waiting, for the shoe to fall. I think that there's two rules. You tell the truth when you write and you don't hurt anyone. And that seems like impossible. If you do one, how can you do the other? You meditate very hard, and the most important thing is for everyone to write. If you want to be an author, that's the opposite of writing to me, because writing is about truly taking your demons and transforming them and composting them into light. You start wherever you are, and you write 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 until out of that muck and rage and smallness and evil, a little white flower grows out of that. But it takes a long time, sometimes your whole life. And that's when you know you're done. So you don't show anyone anything until you get to the little white flower. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't write it. You should write it, and you can tear it up. You can eat it. You can throw it in the ocean. You let it go so that it doesn't roil and destroy you. Because if you don't transform your demons, they transform you.
Boy, that's the truth.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking this panel for their wonderful evening, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you.